Athens, the shining jewel of the ancient world, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and some of the greatest minds in history. To walk its streets in the 5th century BCE was to stand at the center of human thought and culture. Marble temples gleamed in the sun. Philosophers argued in the agora. Artists painted and sculpted visions of perfection that would echo through the ages. But behind the polished image of reason and freedom, another Athens existed, one that was darker, hidden, and forbidden. A world of private chambers and secret rituals, where desire was not only indulged, but institutionalized. And at the heart of it all stood a practice that would disturb even some of their contemporaries: the exploitation of young male slaves, boys pressed into service as objects of intimacy and submission. Imagine an Athenian symposium. The air is heavy with incense and wine. Reclining men, powerful and educated, raise their cups to toast philosophy and politics. But scattered among them are children, slaves, often purchased or captured, their roles unspoken, yet painfully clear. They pour the wine, they play the flute, they serve at the table, and when the night deepens, some are summoned behind closed doors, where philosophy and pleasure blur into something far more troubling. To the Athenians, this was not scandalous in the way it seems to us today. It was embedded in the social fabric, wrapped in the language of mentorship, culture, even education. Men justified it as part of paideia, the shaping of youth into citizens. But beneath the lofty ideals lay a crueler truth: the absolute power of free men over those with no rights. For slaves, boys taken in war, purchased in markets, or born into bondage, there was no choice, no voice, no escape. This is the Athens we rarely speak of. Not the cradle of democracy, but the crucible of contradiction. A city that celebrated freedom while normalizing sexual domination. A society that raised Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, yet also turned young bodies into commodities. And while ancient comedies and court records sometimes mocked or condemned the excesses of these practices, they also reveal just how common and accepted they were. What makes this history so unsettling is not simply that it happened, but how seamlessly it coexisted with the ideals we still praise. The same men who debated justice in the assembly returned home to exercise absolute injustice within their walls. The same culture that worshipped beauty elevated it through exploitation. And yet, even in Athens, unease stirred. Philosophers questioned the morality. Citizens accused rivals in court of improper relations. Playwrights satirized the hypocrisy in biting comedies. It was a tension always simmering beneath the surface, the pride of a civilization masking its darkest appetites. Tonight, we step into that hidden Athens. We uncover the rituals, the scandals, the politics, and the intimate horrors that shaped a society we thought we knew. Because the truth is this: the most disturbing practices of Athens were not barbarian imports, nor foreign corruption. They were born in the very heart of the city itself. And as we peel back the layers of marble, wine, and philosophy, we discover a history of power, desire, and control that is as unsettling as it is unforgettable. But the real shock was yet to come. To understand Athens, one must understand its obsession with power, not just on the battlefield or in the assembly, but in the most intimate corners of life. Sexuality in the ancient world was not merely a matter of pleasure. It was a weapon, a hierarchy, a declaration of dominance. In Athens, the relationship between a free adult male and a younger partner, whether slave or free, was framed as mentorship, a guiding of youth into manhood. This practice, known as pederasty, was praised by poets, justified by philosophers, and carved into art. But beneath the carefully crafted rhetoric of education lay a brutal truth. These relationships often masked exploitation. The younger partner, whether an enslaved boy or an adolescent citizen, had little control. The adult held all the authority, and with it, the power to shape or scar a life forever. desire was cloaked in the language of virtue. An older man claimed he was teaching wisdom, courage, and discipline through intimacy. The boy, in turn, was expected to submit gracefully, absorbing not only lessons, but the unspoken rules of power. In theory, it was about mentorship. In practice, it blurred the line between guidance and abuse. And for slaves, there was no pretense of choice at all. Their role was to serve, body, mind, and soul. The psychology of control through intimacy is as old as civilization itself. By turning sexuality into a hierarchy, Athens reinforced its social order. Free men stood at the top. Women were relegated to silence, their roles confined to the household. And beneath them all, in the shadows, stood the slaves, objects of labor by day and of desire by night. This unspoken system created a constant reminder: freedom was not universal. Power was expressed through possession, and nothing symbolized that more than control over another's body. But the Athenians lived with contradictions. While public rhetoric exalted moderation and restraint, private behavior often reveled in excess. Philosophers like Plato, in his Symposium, celebrated the love between men as a divine pursuit of beauty and truth. Yet in the same city, countless young slaves experienced this divine pursuit as forced compliance. For every lofty speech on the virtues of love, there were unspoken cries lost to history. Desire was also political. A man who could command affection or submission from others displayed his status. Influence was not measured only in wealth or eloquence, but in the visible presence of youths who attended him. To be surrounded by handsome boys was a mark of prestige. To be mocked in plays for overindulgence was both shame and proof of one's notoriety. Sexuality was currency, spent to secure loyalty, to humiliate rivals, to affirm one's dominance in the eyes of the city. This double standard shaped Athenian identity. For the elites, forbidden practices were tolerated, even celebrated, as marks of sophistication. For the commoners, there was a mixture of resentment and envy. Slaves bore the worst of it, reduced to silent instruments in rituals of power. And yet, the Athenians insisted that this was culture, not cruelty. But beneath the veneer of philosophy and mentorship, the reality was undeniable. Sexuality in Athens was not just about pleasure, it was about control. The freedom of some was built upon the submission of others. And in this contradiction, the seeds of scandal and downfall were already being sown. And soon, Athens would face a scandal so great that it threatened to expose the hypocrisy at the very heart of its society. If Athens built its reputation on freedom and philosophy, then nothing revealed its hidden contradictions more than the scandals that erupted from within its own ruling class. These were not whispered rumors confined to dark alleys, but public spectacles that shook the foundations of politics and reputation. And one of the most infamous figures at the center of such scandal was Alcibiades, a man whose brilliance, beauty, and appetites made him both adored and despised. Alcibiades was no ordinary Athenian. Handsome, eloquent, and fearless, he rose quickly in politics and military command. To some, he was the very embodiment of Athens' energy and ambition. To others, he was a dangerous figure, drunk on power, lust, and self-indulgence. His enemies accused him of everything from treason to blasphemy, but at the heart of many charges lay one forbidden truth: his scandalous affairs with youths. In Athens, accusations of improper sexual relations were a political weapon. To be an Erastes, the older partner in a mentorship, was socially acceptable. But to abuse this role, to pursue boys too aggressively, or to treat freeborn youths as if they were slaves, was seen as shameful. Alcibiades' rivals claimed that he crossed every boundary. One story told of his relationship with a young boy from a noble family. The boy's relatives accused Alcibiades not of mentorship, but of corruption, of turning affection into exploitation, of treating the youth less like a partner in education and more like a possession. In the courts, And on the comic stage, the image of Alcibiades as a man enslaved by his own desires spread like wildfire. Aristophanes, in his biting plays, lampooned him as a reckless figure who blurred the lines between love, lust, and politics. But Alcibiades was not alone. The circle of Socrates, too, faced public scrutiny. The philosopher himself often spoke of the beauty of young men, cloaking his passion in metaphors of truth and wisdom. Yet his enemies accused him of hypocrisy, using philosophy as a mask for desire. In 399 BCE, when Socrates was put on trial, one of the charges leveled against him was the corruption of the youth. Though framed as a moral accusation, it carried the heavy implication of sexual scandal. The human cost of these scandals was immense. Families feared that their sons, meant to be molded into citizens, might instead be reduced to trophies of powerful men. Political rivals weaponized. For Alcibiades, the accusations followed him throughout his career. Even when he commanded armies, his reputation for indulgence and transgression cast a shadow. To his supporters, he was simply embodying Athenian freedom, living without restraint. To his enemies, he was proof that the city's moral rot began at the top. His downfall came not only from military defeats and betrayals, but from a life lived so brazenly that it blurred every boundary of morality and politics. This was the paradox of Athens, a society that normalized what we would call exploitation, yet still tore itself apart with accusations of excess. Public morality and private indulgence collided again and again, producing scandals that revealed the fragile hypocrisy beneath Athenian greatness. And if Alcibiades showed how personal appetites could destroy reputations, the next revelation would expose how intimacy itself became a weapon in the brutal game of politics. In Athens, politics was never fought solely in the assembly or on the battlefield. Power was just as often won or lost behind closed doors in the intimate spaces where desire blurred into strategy. Seduction was not merely a private indulgence, it was a political weapon, a tool for forging alliances, for humiliating rivals, and for bending loyalties. For the elite, relationships with young men carried symbolic weight. To be seen surrounded by handsome youths was more than vanity. It was a performance of influence. Each youth represented not just beauty, but a network of families, connections, and favors. To mentor or to exploit, such a boy meant placing a subtle chain around the household he came from. This intimacy could secure a lifetime of loyalty or ignite a feud that spilled into public life. Accusations of sexual misconduct became common, ammunition in political rivalries. If a man could be portrayed as excessive, predatory, or shameless, his credibility in public office was weakened. Athenian comedy thrived on these scandals, with playwrights mocking generals and politicians for their appetites. Aristophanes' plays often turned Athens' most powerful men into grotesque caricatures, lustful, effeminate, or enslaved by desire. Behind the laughter, though, lay very real political consequences. Consider the case of Timarchus, an Athenian politician accused by his rival Aeschines of prostituting himself in his youth. The accusation destroyed him. In a society where controlled intimacy was tolerated but being used was shameful, Timarchus's past rendered him unfit for politics. The irony is chilling. Men who openly exploited slaves and courted adolescents could themselves be ruined if accused of having once been submissive. Power in Athens was not just about who you controlled, but about proving you had never been controlled yourself. Even religion became entangled in these sexual power plays. Certain rituals and festivals offered opportunities for private indulgence. Wealthy men used sacred gatherings not just to worship the gods, but to flaunt their influence through the youths who accompanied them. The line between devotion and debauchery was razor thin, and when accusations arose of sacrilege, such as the infamous mutilation of the Herms in 415 BCE, rumors of secret orgies and profane rituals spread like wildfire. Political rivals seized on these whispers, framing private scandals as crimes against the gods themselves. Women, though largely excluded from politics, were not absent from this web of intrigue. Mistresses, concubines, and even courtesans played their own subtle roles. A well-placed courtesan could relay secrets from one faction to another, or manipulate affections to sway decisions. The scandal of a woman's presence at a symposium could be enough to shame a rival, unless, of course, her involvement was framed as entertainment sanctioned by her master. In Athens, intimacy was never just intimacy. Every act had political weight. Every rumor could be fatal. Behind the marble debates on democracy, the true game of power was often fought in whispers, in accusations, in beds, and while some men rose on the wings of scandal, others fell. For the city itself, the cost was enormous. Athens' enemies mocked it as decadent and corrupt, while within its walls, mistrust festered. The very practices that elites defended as culture and education were weaponized to destroy each other. But perhaps the greatest irony was this. While elites indulged in their forbidden desires, it was the ordinary people, the slaves, the wives, the common citizens, who carried the burden of their excesses. And in the daily life of Athens, the double standards of power became even more disturbing. While the scandals of men like Alcibiades shook the courts and the assembly, the true weight of Athens' sexual hierarchies was felt far from the political stage, woven into the fabric of daily life. Behind the marble facades and grand debates, families, slaves, and ordinary citizens lived in a society where intimacy was governed by power, not equality. Marriage in Athens was, above all, a contract. Women were married young, often in their early teens, and chosen for their ability to bear children rather than for companionship. A respectable wife managed the household and raised legitimate heirs, but she rarely shared in her husband's passions. For many men, their true desires played out elsewhere, at the symposium, with courtesans, or with boys. The double standard was glaring. Women were expected to remain modest, silent, and faithful, while men indulged freely, their appetites sanctioned by custom. For slaves, daily life was harsher still. A household might contain not only domestic workers, but also boys and girls bought explicitly for sexual service. They had no say, no protection, no recourse. Their bodies were possessions, as much as a pot or a cloak. Historians describe how wealthy Athenians would flaunt such slaves as signs of status, parading them at feasts or using them to amuse guests. What to us reads as brutality was, to them, part of the machinery of social life. Among ordinary citizens, opinions were divided. Some accepted these practices as the natural order of things. Others felt unease, especially when exploitation touched freeborn youths. Parents worried about the attentions of older men toward their sons. Laws were passed, forbidding free boys from prostitution, a sign that Athenian society recognized the danger of excess even as it normalized it. Yet these laws did little to protect slaves, who remained outside the concern of lawmakers. Religion, too, reflected and reinforced these taboos. Myths celebrated the love of gods for beautiful boys. Zeus's abduction of Ganymede was told not as a crime, but as divine favor. Festivals often included dances or rituals where young men were displayed in ways that blurred the line between reverence and objectification. By embedding desire into myth and ritual, Athens gave cultural sanction to practices that would otherwise seem unspeakable. The cultural double standards were sharp. For elites, indulgence was framed as sophistication, a marker of education and refinement. For the commoner, excess was mocked as vulgarity. What was tolerated in a philosopher might be condemned in a tradesman. The rules shifted according to class, wealth, and influence, and at the center of it all stood gender roles that defined the Athenian world. Men commanded, women obeyed, slaves served, youths submitted. This hierarchy was never questioned because it was stitched into every thread of life, from the household to the courts, from the theater to the temples. Yet cracks were always visible. Satirical plays mocked hypocrisy. Court cases exposed the humiliations endured by families. Whispers in the agora spoke of corruption, decadence, and the fear that Athens' greatness was rotting from within. And soon, Athens would face a moment where the indulgences of its citizens could no longer be ignored. A turning point when scandal and excess went too far, forcing the city to confront the taboos it had so long embraced. Every society that indulges in excess eventually reaches its breaking point. For Athens, that moment came when private scandals began to spill into the public sphere, when the quiet indulgences of the elite grew too brazen to ignore. What had once been tolerated as custom or culture now became the center of outrage, satire, and even law. One of the clearest signs of this shift came in the mid-4th century BCE, when the courts took up cases that openly challenged the sexual practices of powerful men. The trial of Timarchus was the most infamous. His rival, the orator Aeschines, accused him of having prostituted himself as a youth, a charge that carried devastating consequences. In Athenian culture, the shame was not placed upon the older men who sought such arrangements, but upon the youth who was perceived as having surrendered his body for gain. To have been penetrated as a freeborn citizen was considered a permanent stain, one that disqualified a man from holding office or speaking in the assembly. The court condemned Timarchus, stripping him of his political rights. The scandal revealed a deep hypocrisy. The very same men who privately exploited slaves and youths weaponized accusations of passivity to destroy their enemies. The city that normalized domination punished those who had been dominated. What had once been framed as mentorship now became evidence of corruption. Religion, too, became a battleground. In 415 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, Athens was shaken by the mutilation of the Hermes, stone statues of the god Hermes placed across the city. Their faces were smashed, their phallic symbols defaced. Panic spread, for this was no ordinary act of vandalism. Many believed it was tied to secret sexual rites, profane gatherings in which the sacred symbols of the gods were mocked or desecrated. Suspicion fell on Alcibiades, already infamous for his extravagance and rumored debaucheries. His enemies seized the opportunity, branding him a man whose private appetites endangered not just morality, but the very favor of the gods. The political fallout was immense. Alcibiades was recalled from his command and fled into exile, his reputation destroyed by whispers of orgies and blasphemy. For Athens, it was proof that indulgence could no longer be confined to the private sphere. It had corrupted politics, religion, and even the safety of the city itself. Philosophers, too, began to push back. In Plato's Laws, there is a sharp critique of unrestrained sexual desire, an insistence that the city must regulate appetites before they consumed the state. What had once been wrapped in the language of mentorship and divine love was now reframed as dangerous excess. The tension that had always simmered beneath the surface finally broke into open debate. And for the powerless, the slaves, the youths, the women, the consequences of this turning point were complex. Some protections were carved into law, forbidding the prostitution of freeborn youths. But for those without status, little changed. Exploitation continued, only now it was cloaked more carefully, hidden behind the fear of scandal. Athens had reached its limit. The very practices it once celebrated as part of culture and education were now recast as corruption and threat. And in this shift lay the seeds of the city's decline, its contradictions laid bare for all to see. But the story does not end here. For the consequences of Athens' forbidden practices would ripple far beyond its walls, shaping empires, religions, and moral codes for centuries to come. The taboos and indulgences of Athens did not fade quietly into history. They left scars, ripples, and legacies that reached far beyond the city's borders. For while Athens fell to Sparta and later to Macedon, the memory of its excesses haunted the imagination of both its admirers and its enemies. The first and most immediate consequence was reputation. To many Greek states, Athens was both admired and mocked, a city of brilliance, but also of decadence. Its enemies portrayed it as corrupt, weakened by luxury and by appetites that undermined discipline. Sparta, austere and militaristic, contrasted itself against Athenian indulgence, casting the democracy not as enlightened, but as morally rotted. In war propaganda, whispers of Athenian immorality were wielded as easily as spears. When Rome rose to power, it inherited not only Greek philosophy and art, but also fragments of its sexual culture. Roman elites, too, practiced relationships with boys, often framing them in the same language of mentorship and education. Yet Rome also absorbed the hypocrisy. Free citizens were protected, while slaves were objects without rights. The Roman poet Juvenal would later sneer at both Greek and Roman indulgence, his verses filled with disgust at elites who flaunted their depravity while preaching morality. Over time, however, the tide turned. The rise of Christianity reframed Athenian practices as symbols of corruption and sin. Early Christian writers pointed to Athens as proof that pagan societies were morally bankrupt, their gods and myths tainted by lust and violence. The love of Zeus for Ganymede, once celebrated as divine favor, became a story of abduction and shame. Philosophical discourses on beauty and mentorship were reinterpreted as disguises for exploitation. In this new moral framework, Athens' legacy was rewritten, not as a city of balance, but as a warning of what happens when desire rules unchecked. Archaeology confirms what texts only hint at. Painted pottery depicts symposium scenes with unsettling clarity. Men reclining, boys serving, gestures that leave little to the imagination. These fragments, dug from the earth centuries later, tell the silent stories of those who could not speak for themselves. Court speeches, too, survive on papyrus, their words sharp with accusation and defense. They reveal not only the practices, but the unease, the moral fractures, and the attempts to draw lines that were constantly crossed. Perhaps the most haunting consequence, though, lies in the contradictions we still wrestle with today. Athens gave the world democracy, philosophy, and art that continue to shape human thought. Yet it also normalized systems of domination that destroyed countless lives. Its legacy is not clean. It is tangled, brilliant, and brutal, inspiring and horrifying in equal measure. The taboo practices of Athens became lessons, whether spoken or unspoken, for generations that followed. They served as warnings for reformers, as justification for moral crusades, as symbols in the eternal struggle between freedom and control, desire and restraint. And even now, their echoes remain. For as we look to the past, we are forced to ask, how much of what Athens hid still lurks in our own societies, disguised, justified, and waiting to be uncovered? Athens is remembered as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and human freedom. But as we have seen, beneath the marble temples and golden words lay a society built on contradictions. It celebrated freedom, but only for a few. It praised wisdom, but excused exploitation. It carved ideals of beauty into stone, even as it turned living bodies into possessions. The most disturbing practices of Athens, the sexual domination of young male slaves, the manipulation of freeborn youths, the use of intimacy as a weapon of politics, were not aberrations. They were woven into the fabric of daily life, sanctioned by culture and defended by rhetoric. This was not the corruption of a few powerful men. It was a system, one that sustained the city's hierarchies and exposed the hypocrisy at its core. Yet, Athens' story is not simply a tale of condemnation. It is a mirror, for the echoes of its taboos continue to reverberate in our own world. Political scandals shaped by desire, institutions rocked by hidden abuse, the powerful shielding themselves with culture, tradition, or prestige. These are not relics of the past. They are modern headlines. The faces may change, but the dynamics of power and intimacy remain chillingly familiar. we still wrestle with the same questions Athens faced. Where is the line between mentorship and exploitation? How do we protect the powerless when society elevates the powerful? And how often do we disguise indulgence as culture or corruption as sophistication? The Athenians framed their practices as education, philosophy, even divine inspiration. Today, similar justifications are heard in boardrooms, institutions, and governments across the globe. The unanswered mysteries of Athens remain. How many voices were lost, their stories buried because they belonged to slaves who could not write? How many scandals were erased, their records destroyed by those who had everything to lose? We will never know the full scale of what happened behind closed doors, in the city of Socrates and Pericles. But the fragments we do have, the court cases, the plays, the pottery, whisper truths that Athens itself tried to conceal. And so, the legacy of Athens is both inspiring and horrifying. A city that dreamed of equality while practicing domination. A culture that gave us philosophy while living by hypocrisy. Its contradictions remind us that greatness and cruelty can coexist, that even the brightest civilizations cast the darkest shadows. As you listen to this story, ask yourself, what would you have done in the courtrooms of Athens when accusations of corruption tore through the assembly? Would you have looked away? Laughed at the plays that mocked the victims? Or spoken against the most powerful men of your time, knowing the cost? Because history is never only about the past. The secrets of Athens force us to confront our present. They remind us that beneath the surface of every society, whether ancient or modern, lies a struggle between desire and control, freedom and domination. The cradle of democracy was also a cradle of taboo. And the real question is not just what Athens hid, but what secrets we are still hiding today. What other forbidden truths still lie buried in history, waiting for us to uncover them?